Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's thinking. I was rather enjoying that soothing music, lulling me off to sleep a little bit. My name's Liz Mosley. I'm the editor of this evening's thinking. I'd like to wish you all a happy April the 12th. I am in the newsroom and there are people here in central London. They're going in and out of shops. They're carrying bags. I can confirm that it still feels rather strange and somber, but we feel like we've passed another milestone. So I hope you're all okay. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. If you haven't been to a thinking before, what we try and do in these hour-long conversations is to find stories, news stories. We're a newsroom after all, but also to try and thrash out a bit of a point of view on something that we think is important. And mental health, particularly mental ill health, is something we've talked about a lot in the past 12 months, especially. My colleague Patricia put together the slides of the data that you saw just now, and she will be in the chat. Hello, Patricia. So please do join in, type along, respond to what you hear on screen. I'd love to hear your stories, challenge us, and share a perspective. Sometimes it feels as though the words mental health have become a sort of natural precursor to the word crisis. I feel in the thinkings that we've had either about mental ill health or about other things where mental illness has come up as part of our discussion and our analysis, we sort of agree the situation is bad, we agree service provision is struggling, we agree that social media has made it exponentially worse, we agree we're worried about how it's all going to play out. And I watched the documentary about the life and death of Caroline Flack that was broadcast on the BBC not long ago. And I found myself reflecting on why it might be that in spite of the fact that we've talked about mental illness a lot in thinkings for Tortoise over the past 12 months particularly, we've never really got anywhere beyond admiring what I have come to accept as a sort of ballooning enormous problem. We've never really got anywhere with it in terms of journalistically how we can help to report it out, or really properly understanding it. And I wanted to have a go this evening at looking at it in a bit of a different way. For me, I have a particular interest in the way that the language of mental health, words like trauma and psychotic and depressed, are sort of played out and used in both normal conversations you have with your friends and family, and in sort of wider social discourse, and in particular how careful we are or not at the usage of those words and understanding their impact and what they come to mean, especially when we're talking about things, for example, like domestic abuse and violent crime. So that's a particular interest of mine, which we might talk about this evening. Because what mental illness is and what it isn't really, really matters. I'm interested to explore how well we understand collectively what it is and what it isn't, and how effective the structures are that we rely on to be good at discerning between what is a mental illness and what isn't, are working, not just for mental health provision and sort of medical services and things, but also in education settings, in workplaces and in criminal justice too. Now, it may be that I'm very interested in this because I've been twice diagnosed with a mental health condition myself in my life, and I have twice resisted that diagnosis and don't think it's right, maybe. It may be that I'm particularly interested in Caroline Flack in particular, and bless her, we heard about the news of the death of Nikki Graham, who was another sort of reality TV star, I guess, at the weekend, because I used to be the publisher of Heat magazine. So when it comes to inappropriate or irresponsible language use, I have not insignificant experience and some guilt at having contributed to the challenges. But the exam question for tonight is when we think about the 12 months or so, it's a little bit longer than that actually, that have elapsed since Caroline Flack died by suicide. What have we learned really? What can we see now? And where we've spent a year, as I say, admiring the problem, the ballooning problem of people's mental ill health, particularly in this country, have we missed really what's happening? And that's what I'm trying to explore this evening. So to start us off, I'm going to go to our first invited expert, Dr. Lucy Fox, who's a psychologist. Hello, Lucy. Hello.
Hi, sorry.
That's okay. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for being here. Now, Lucy, you have written a book. It's called Losing Our Minds, in which you really try to examine with the sort of with a dispassionate and scientific lens some of the data, some of the methodology, some of the research on the data that is, I might say, bandied around, or at least sort of handled in not only the media and in newspapers and on social media and so on, but also by mental health charities and campaigns and things like that. And I'd love for you to sort of unpack for us a little bit what the thesis is for your book and why you feel that this is a way of talking about mental health that needs to be aired.
Well, I wanted to write the book for exactly the reason you described. So I noticed there was this huge growing interest in mental health and mental illness, and the way we talk about it has transformed. And I started to question how accurate were some of the stats, information we were given, and also how useful was it actually. What had started as a very helpful idea to try and destigmatize mental health and illness, I wondered whether there had been, and in the book I call it, some collateral damage. So I wrote the book to try and provide some clarity on the topic, to try and explain my understanding of what mental health and mental illness is as a big, messy spectrum, to try and provide some clarity and reassurance.
How would improved raised awareness, people's ability to spot perhaps where their work colleagues or their friends or family are struggling with their mental health, how would people being better at that possibly create collateral damage?
Well, so that's the good part of it, is in terms of people better understanding themselves, better understanding the people around them, and being less afraid to come forward. That's absolutely a good thing, and the campaigns, when they have had that impact, have been brilliant. My concern is that by pumping out this information without sufficient depth, particularly the terminology, like what you said in terms of psychosis, PTSD, OCD, whether these terms might be being used inaccurately now in a way that's actually unhelpful for the people themselves. So, for example, if you go through something really difficult, of course that's upsetting and challenging, and you might need professional help. You will certainly need support, but is it useful to always call it PTSD, for example? So my concern is that broadly, of course, it's a good thing. We're in a better position than we were before in terms of openness, but whether there might have been a side effect, which is that we're slightly muddled about what some of these terms mean, which means some people are unhelpfully absorbing these terms, and the people who really are seriously unwell are still not being heard or not well understood.
So you get a kind of progressive devaluing almost of the term because it becomes too widely used or used in an inappropriate way. I'd love to know, the detail is so important when you're handling statistics of this nature, and there's a really helpful chunk of the book where you really talk about the methodology that is used to diagnose people, but in particular with anxiety and depression. They quite often lumped together. I don't know if they are the same or different, and there's a difference between people reporting symptoms of those conditions and people being diagnosed conclusively by, I suppose, a practitioner of some kind, or those things. And actually the sort of layers of why that's hard to get accurate and reliable statistics and to make even an accurate and reliable diagnosis are really complex. There's a lot of ways that make it different, reasons that it's hard, basically.
Exactly. So I think one really nice example of this is the fact that antidepressant prescriptions have doubled in about 10 years. So and why is that? Well, one explanation is that twice as many people are depressed, or you can be prescribed them for various mental illnesses, but for simplicity's sake, twice as many people are depressed now than they were 10 years ago. It could also be that people now better recognise their own distress and are more able to seek help for it, and it's better recognised at the GP. So that means more people are being prescribed medication, more people are getting help, but actually the absolute number of people who are unwell 10 years ago now hasn't changed. It's it's stress that was always there. It was depression that was always there. It's just that we're now able to talk about it. That's a good thing. there's a third possibility, which is that people are now being prescribed antidepressants too readily, or labeling common distress too readily as depression. So there's three, whenever there's a report of an increase, there's those three things going on. And that's what's slightly sticky to try and unpack.
And Lucy, in a way, that the third option that you just described, the possibility that people who are not really mentally ill, but just are having a tough time with it, I know that the language is difficult, but to illustrate the point, are going to the doctor and receiving prescribed medication to manage what is low mood, but perhaps not a depression. That thing is very difficult to articulate without it seeming as though you're trying to diminish people's pain and their suffering. There's a sort of, if I were to say that sentence I just said with a slightly different tone and intonation in my voice, I would be doing exactly the opposite from what all of the good work that goes into sort of helping people, sort of rolling your eyes and go, everybody's depressed these days, people just need to get a grip and pull themselves together, which of course is not really what we're trying to say, but nonetheless is I think strongly held view by some people.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you bring that up, because I think it's so important that for me to clarify that that's absolutely not what I'm saying. I see that as the kind of Piers Morgan approach, which is so I feel like the beginning of the argument is sort of similar, which is that we're suddenly talking a lot about mental health, we're labeling a lot of things as mental illness, where someone like Piers Morgan might say everyone's just being a snowflake and needs to stop talking about it. I feel we need to talk about all of it. It doesn't matter whether your distress meets the criteria for a disorder, it really doesn't. We should take the whole spectrum of it seriously. Firstly, because, the stuff that doesn't meet a threshold of a disorder is still really difficult. But secondly, because actually that can be the start of something more serious. So we absolutely do need to take the whole spectrum seriously. And this is really the point I wanted to make in the book. We need to take it seriously. We need to talk about it. But don't feel, if you personally don't find it helpful to interpret your experiences, related to what you were saying earlier, if you don't find that labeling helpful, then don't feel you have to take it on just because you've seen a lot of articles about it.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Lucy. I'm going to come now to Dolly. Dolly Sen, you're a mental health campaigner and an artist. And you were involved in the very beginning, and it was mentioned on the slides at the start, the really big Time to Change campaign, which I'm sure everybody who's here this evening has witnessed, received the messaging of. I wonder if you might tell us about the sort of inception of that campaign back in 2007.
Well, I saw that there was this campaign to tackle discrimination and stigma in mental health, and as I was a person that was at the wrong end of it, I thought, it's a good idea and a good plan. And I was part of the first action of Time to Change, public action, in which a Sheffield tram was turned into a padded cell, a commuter tram, and there were plants in the tram. So there was about 4 or 5 of us who basically were there to talk to the morning communities about mental health, which was an interesting experience in itself. People actually wanted to talk about it, and there were some really sad stories as well. But as the campaign progressed, and I found out I was being censored about certain aspects of, I wanted to talk about discrimination in the mental health service, which there is a lot of, but that doesn't really get talked about. And I also wanted to talk about how some government policy was making things difficult for people with long-term mental health issues. And I was told I can't talk about that, to the point they stopped using me when I said I wanted to talk about those things. And they had plenty of people who wanted to be a volunteer and talk about distress and discrimination and stigma, but I think it was a very simplistic campaign, in that it didn't want to tackle that kind of stigma and discrimination, and also it was only really, I think, directed at the worried well. So, for example, there was these ideas of having coffee mornings and people talking about their mental health, but I have a psychotic condition, and although I've been quite well for many years, there was a point in time I thought I was Jesus. So if I went to this coffee morning and these lovely old ladies gave me a cup of tea and cake, and they said, "Oh, well, so how's your mental health?" I said, "Well, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm Jesus." How do you think
Not going to help.
how could they respond without getting any guidance from Time to Change or any idea of my life, really? So yeah, I started off as a fan and then ended up as a critic.
That's really interesting, Dolly. So when the thing that you wanted to talk about that was deemed sort of too, I don't know, did you have a sense of why? Was it just that, oh, that's out of our scope, or was it, or we want for it to be friendly and we think that what you want to talk about is a bit scary for people? Was that more the vibe? What was driving the sort of resistance to the things you wanted?
It wasn't articulated to me, and I'm assuming it because it was government money towards,
right, yeah,
that fueled the campaign. They weren't allowed to critique the government, and that's my assumption.
Right.
So I really don't know, but yeah, but this is the whole point. Why is my condition scary? Why not do something with the campaign to kind of bring it out into the open and talk about it, rather than saying, this person with this condition is not an axe murderer. Actually, I'm not, but I could be plenty of other things. And
yeah,
people with similar conditions to mine, we were just, I think, forgotten in the Time to Change campaign.
Interesting. So there was sort of within the scope of the campaign, there was a sort of discriminatory aspect to it as you experienced it. That's interesting. Yeah, thanks, Dolly. I'm going to come to Chris, because Chris, I think, can sort of build a little bit on some of the things that Dolly is saying. You're a mental health campaigner too. You're the host of Walk a Mile in My Shoes podcast. Has spent lots of time over many years with people who have mental health conditions, but also exploring their stories and thinking this through inside and out and always round. One of the really sort of major shifts of the last decade has been this idea of mental health awareness, and Dolly's kind of touched on this sense that there are some forms of mental ill health that are okay, and other forms that we all want to talk about, and that's the thing we should be talking about, to the detriment of others. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, depression and anxiety are lovely, aren't they? But it's the other stuff. Just to hop back to Time to Change, you are aware that Time to Change have just closed their doors.
Yes, in March. Yeah,
and that's, even though they were politically, what's the word, inept. I think it's important to mark that and say, in Scotland there is still an anti-stigma campaign program going on. See me. Sorry, I've gone off on a tangent. What was the question?
I was talking about this sense of like a hierarchy of mental ill health conditions, and which ones are okay and which ones are really not.
I think we've got the cute and cuddly ones. But I think that talking about, there's a feeling here in the conversation, and I may well be reading it wrong, is that the raising awareness has somehow unveiled a lot of people who don't necessarily have a mental health problem. And I think two things we need to be looking at. We are a country in trauma. We're a stressed country. When preparing for this, I was wired by the time I finished. I mean, if you're looking for reasons for mental ill health, we've got 14 million people in poverty, 330,000 people homeless, 1.9 million people using phone max, coronavirus insecurity, etc., and so on. We're talking about crisis. We're talking about how do you define crisis? There's been, as a social worker, people will come to me and say, I'm in crisis. And as a social worker back in the day, I'd say, no, I'll be the judge of that. And I recently worked with an organization who used user-defined crisis. So if somebody came to us and said, I'm in crisis, you believed them. You would believe that they were in crisis. The other thing is, services are on their knees. They are terrible. I can't emphasize that enough. For example, I'll use myself as an example. 2 years ago, and it's still the case today, suicidal ideation, I self-harm, and I dissociate between a third of the time and 2/3 of the time. So I was referred to my community mental health team. I recently spoke to a psychiatrist from that team 2 years ago. So 2 years have passed. They told me they couldn't tell me if I was still on the waiting list. So I had to ask them, can you find out? And the only thing they were able to confirm was I was still on the waiting list. They had no idea when I'm going to be seen. And I'm not the only person that's happening to. Just going back to the pill thing, GPs are in a state of panic as well, I think. Instead of giving people access to talking therapies, GPs are throwing pills at folk. And so many people aren't getting their needs addressed. They're getting pills, and pills have side effects, and they're not dealing with the issue.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to come back to Lucy. So there's a couple of things in what Chris has just said. On the one hand, and it might be, you might not know the answer to this, so please feel free to say if you don't. But is it true to say, can we say GPs are prescribing medication to people who would be better off with other forms of therapy? Can we say that conclusively or no?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment to make, that will definitely be the case for some people. Talking therapy is not available enough, or people have to wait too long for it. So yeah, I think there are cases where GPs feel like their hands are tied.
So driven by the shape of the service provision, which is too small or not in the right place.
Yeah, I mean, if medical
alternative is a more immediate way to help somebody who's can't wait 6 months or however long it is to get into a talking therapy.
Exactly. Yeah, if you've got to wait 6 months or 12 months or more and you need help now, then often that might be what would encourage GP to use medication. But yeah, Chris brought up an important point, that often it doesn't tackle the issue, and we know that a lot of what causes mental health problems and mental illness is stress in the outside world, and that stress can come in many different forms. So I think it was important that Chris picked that up, and that is certainly a criticism sometimes of medication, that it doesn't tap the root cause of what are very difficult lives often.
One of the things I wanted to ask you in particular, and we saw a slide at the beginning that showed those really sharp, and I remember it when it first sort of started filtering through in about June time of last year, very, very sharp instances of people across all age groups who had reported, I think the source is the Office for National Statistics, easy for me to say, sharp increases of people in this country in that first quarter's worth of lockdown reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression. Now, it doesn't take a genius to sit back and kind of go, well, of course, because it's been horrendous and much worse than anything any of us can imagine, a perfect storm. How, with your sort of dispassionate lens and everything you said about how difficult it is to say conclusively if it is or if it isn't, how are we still too close to the impact of lockdown to say how much of a problem are we now facing? Has it been overdone, or do you think, is it impossible to say?
Well, I think that's the key thing about the pandemic's effects. We just don't really know yet. We're still kind of in it, especially in terms of lockdown. There are external contexts which matter so much for mental health, keeps changing. We're in and out of lockdown, and there's some interesting evidence from last year that things did increase temporarily at first, but then they dropped in terms of general distress and symptoms of anxiety and depression. And again, I saw some preliminary stuff in children, adolescents, that in January it went up again. When the lockdown was announced again. So we don't know for sure yet. We're still very much in the thick of it, and it takes time for these things to trickle through. I think it's also important in all of this to not make the assumption that the pandemic has affected everyone in the same way. And this is, again, one thing I'm cautious about in terms of language, is suggesting that everyone is in a crisis as a result of the pandemic, because I think, using language like, tsunami of mental health problems, some people, of course, have been so badly affected by it, but not everyone has. And I think if some people liked lockdown, okay, some people, their mental health improved. So I think what's really important is that we hone in a bit on understanding the groups and the individuals who really have been badly affected, instead of creating a story that everyone is in crisis, because that doesn't help anyone, I don't think.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring a couple of contributions from the room before I go to Nazir and we start to sort of look particularly at criminal justice. There's a number of people are talking about, let's be wary of not always saying a talking therapy is preferable to medication. Of course, that's I completely understand. It's horses for courses, for want of a better expression. But I'd quite like to bring in Ben, if I can, Ben Cropper. You're talking specifically about workplace discrimination, Ben. Hiya.
Hello.
Hiya.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well. I can see you well.
Okay, yeah. I just, I'm a bit wary about the whole discrimination thing, because obviously I'm disabled as well. So I suppose I've got it from that angle, but I couldn't think of a better phrase in my comment. It was just basically, I've been to several job interviews over a number of years now, and I've raised my mental health condition at the outset with employers, and I've always got quite a mixed reaction from it. And you kind of want to be transparent with them, but then you kind of don't want that to be used as a reason not to be given an opportunity. So it's hard to strike a balance, and I just wondered whether the panel had anything about what can be done from a media perspective to raise the issue of mental health discrimination and bring it to public light, really.
Thanks so much, Ben. I think Ben raises a really interesting question. If I find the cynic in me about, to use Chris's words, about the cute and cuddly, I'm not sure I quite buy into depression and anxiety, cute and cuddly conditions. They're not when they're real, but this sort of sense that talking about how we're feeling and going for a cup of tea, the picture that Dolly painted is well and good. And I think talking in general about how we all are, that's good, that we look after each other. But it's sort of a sense that there's all this work over here, but then when the rubber hits the road, and when Ben goes to a prospective employer and says, well, I suffer, with bad clinical depression, and I want to be open with you about that, and he expects that all that awareness work is going to mean that that is met with, we understand and we have systems in place, and thank you for telling us, but it doesn't make a difference. Perhaps that doesn't quite happen. I wonder, Chris, you've been around the block you've been around the country a few times in actual fact. What's your sense of the sort of mismatch, I guess, between the awareness stuff and the sort of HR department initiatives and the posters and all of that, and then actually does it make a difference? I don't want to say the wrong thing.
The problem, I think, with the awareness raising is that when we're raising awareness, we're leaning against an open door. So the people who are listening are the people who were listening before. I think that people who are discriminating will continue to discriminate. I remember Minds put out a bit of a campaign about exactly that, about applying for jobs. And the language they used, I thought, was kind of alarming, because they said, don't disclose your mental health, or you may choose not to disclose your mental health problem when you apply for a job, and then later on tell your employer about your mental health problem. And that really didn't sit comfortably with me. I think ignorance is the enemy here. I've been amazed at applying for jobs as a social worker in the past, and saying I have a mental health problem, and people you see the eyes going he's nuts, and that's really difficult to deal with. But the awareness raising needs to be reaching people that it needs to reach. I mean, that was the whole idea with the walk a mile in my shoes thing. I spoke to everybody as I walked around the edge of the UK. I wasn't targeting people. I was talking to everybody, people who don't ordinarily talk about mental health problems. They had me in their face, and I was talking about my mental health problems, and they suddenly realized, gosh, it's actually okay to talk about mental health. We need, it's all well and good raising awareness, but we need to do it well, I think, is the point I'm trying to get across.
Interesting. Thanks ever so much, Chris. I'm going to bring in Nazir now, if I can. Thank you for waiting, Nazir, while we've kind of kicked off the discussion. The sort of framing for this evening was triggered by my own reflections about what happened with the death of Caroline Flack. And for those who can remember, in her case, she was in the criminal justice system. She was sort of waiting to go to trial when she died by suicide. And the relationship between her mental health, and I can't speculate as to whether she was or she wasn't, I don't know, I'm not a doctor, clearly, and then what happened. It was a huge furore, and the way that she was talked about and her case was talked about in the weeks before she died and then afterwards just made everybody really stop and think. My question to you to begin with, Nazir, as you, the former chief Crown prosecutor, you've written your book, The Prosecutor, it's out now, and you've revised it for lockdown. There are two particular numbers. One is about 70% and one is about 90%. And you can encounter these on big mental health charities, websites, and this is the proportion of people in the prison system, in prison at the moment, who have a reported mental health condition. And huge proportion, almost everybody, you might be so tempted to say. In your long career working in the Crown Prosecution Service, how do you read those statistics, knowing what we know about everything Lucy said about how difficult it is to get accurate data and so on? What's your sense of it?
It's complicated. I think that Chris outlined a moment ago that ignorance is our enemy here, and we don't know enough. We are lumping a lot of things together. So people with mental health illnesses, people with anxiety, depression, people with psychotic conditions or personality disorder, people with substance misuse, alcohol and drugs. And we're saying that they're all part of that 80 or 70 or 90% figure. And that means that we don't break it down. We don't have any sense of that, sense of the reality. And of course, the causative nature of these things, did the drink and the drugs lead to the psychiatric condition or psychological condition? Which is the priority? Which do we treat, the drink or the drugs, or the condition that may have flown from that? So it's, as I say, it's really complicated. But that doesn't in any way take away from the fact that we have some serious problems in our prison services, because we don't have, we're overcrowded. We're pretty much at 98, 97% capacity, but that's ridiculous on the basis of, perhaps two people in a room and not being allowed out for more than an hour a day. The National Health Service, which is responsible for the health of prisoners, clearly has other priorities, and well, that's what it says, and it doesn't prioritize either those in custody or those that are leaving custody or those that are on remand on their way into custody. We have insufficient training. We don't have enough support in the prisons. And just thinking about it, if you're only allowed out of your cell for an hour a day, how do we know? And so I think I have no doubt that that figure is reflective of people who are unwell. Now, what that unwellness is something that we just haven't got the detail on.
Nazir, would you say then that what would be your take on the capacity and the effectiveness of the system, not just the prison bit, but all of the bit that comes before the prison bit, the police bit, the court bit, the whole thing? How effective is the whole thing at discerning between somebody who is really seriously, mentally unwell, and that can mean, as we've said, a whole range of different things, and somebody who isn't? And at the risk of channeling my inner Piers Morgan, I don't really have one, but the risk of that is you point to the sentencing of the man who killed his wife after the very beginning of lockdown. He had a much reduced sentence because the judge ruled that he had been struggling with the first couple of days of lockdown, and there was a sort of great, people throw their hands in the air and go, well, what does that mean? You sort of feel like the sort of mental ill health defense to sort of mitigate against the consequences of your actions. What is your sense of how much that system works, both to protect and support people who really are ill, and the other end as well?
Liz, it's inadequate and ignorant, to put it bluntly. It's almost an add-on now and again. I remember maybe 25 years ago, they started introducing in some courts around the country a diversion program. So you'd have a psychiatrist or a psychologist at court, and if somebody turned up overnight and the prosecutor or defense counsel or judge or magistrate was a bit concerned about them, the case would be put back for 20 minutes or half an hour to enable some quick assessment to be carried out. And if further assessment is required, then that person would then be remanded for further assessment. That diversion scheme, as I said, happened in some courts. It was a victim of cuts and hasn't really been maintained in any way, shape or form. You have to also remember the mental health itself, or mental illness, is a defense to some crimes.
Yeah.
So, you can very rarely be not guilty by reason of insanity. And in other cases, it's used as probably the wrong word, but it can be mitigation. So if somebody wants to avoid a longer prison sentence, they may be able to present evidence that suggests that they are suffering in some way. Now, the other issue with that I have is what we call expert shopping. What tends to happen is the prosecution and police will have one or two, three psychiatrists who will carry out a review of one particular individual, a suspect, for example. The defense will then try and find an alternative view, and they are entitled to get that view. So you then have a jury hearing one expert saying this person is suffering, another expert saying this person is not suffering, and the jury then have to make a judgment. And we'll all be familiar with some serious cases of people who were found guilty, for example, of murder. At the same time, people were saying, he's insane, no, he's guilty of murder. We need to punish him first. We punish him, and then we can rehabilitate him or in some way treat him. So, you can think of some very big name examples of people who were sent to prison for life, perhaps for 50 years or 40, 30, 50 years, but almost immediately then ended up in Broadmoor, a psychiatric hospital, because the public wanted that person not to be found to be ill. They wanted him to be found to be criminal. And so you've got that issue going on. So you've got all these experts competing, and a jury, which is 12 members of the public, then having to make a judgment on the basis of these experts as to what they believe. And, what do you know? What do I know? And if the two experts can't agree, what can I say? So that element is happening. And then you've got probation services not being able to resource proper reporting. We've already heard about the clinical cuts that have had, so we don't know anything about individuals. There's not enough time. There's not enough resources. And people will undoubtedly get through the cracks. So we all know, for example, 8.5 times more likely to take your life compared to the general population if you're in prison. So there's some serious issues about the population of prison, but the system itself throughout really is not playing catch up. It's just doing its best, and doing its best. Well, the answer is simple. In December of 2019, Her Majesty's government, in their manifesto, committed this government to a Royal Commission on Criminal Justice for the first of those in 25 years. And this Royal Commission would be looking at every element of criminal justice, including this major element, and then be able, rather than tinker around the edges as we have been doing with a diversion scheme there, expertise there, actually look at what the system should be like to enable people who need support and need care and need health disposal to get health disposal, those who are criminals. And of course, the one thing I'm never allowed to say, and I don't think I say it in the book either, is that anybody's evil. Nobody is evil. They are all culpable in some way, and that culpability can be an illness, or it can be just because they're nasty, or it can be substance misuse, or whatever it may be. So I think the criminal justice system is doing its best, as I said a moment ago. It can do a great deal more, but it relies upon all these other partners who, quite frankly, are themselves unresourced.
Yeah.
And to take the point that everybody's been using so far, they're confused. They don't know enough about this subject and don't have access to people with the knowledge that will provide them with support. And I, be honest with you, Liz, I was playing at it a lot of the time. You know, I would have 3 psychiatric reports, 2 saying something, another one saying another one. The third one might be more credible than the other 2. Right, what do I do now? And if I'm doing that, and then I present them to the court, and the jury are doing that, and the judge is doing that, we literally are in a situation, quite frankly, where we're playing at it rather than actually fixing it.
Thank you very much, Nazir. Gosh, there's a lot to unpick in that. While I process my thoughts, I'm gonna bring in Nikki Gorb if I can. If you're there, Nikki, you've made a point about communication disorders. I think you're a speech therapist. We've spoken before. You work with people's speech.
Well, I'm a voice specialist and work with people with stammer, do all sorts of things in the NHS and private practice, and work a lot with paediatrics. And we know there are so many studies that show that communication disability and intellectual disability results in lots of people ending up in prison. And there are also young people with communication disabilities are much more vulnerable to mental health problems as well that we've seen. And people don't understand it, teachers don't understand it, the criminal justice service don't understand it. And it sort of goes back to the basics of trying to support the young people when they're young to get the care and support they need. And if you, again, as Nasir was saying, if you cut everything, we are at the very basics of a society not supporting people when they need it. And we know that the more money you put in at the early stages of life, the less difficulties you'll have in both mental health and sort of criminal sort of difficulties.
Thanks, Nikki. I guess the sort of tensions in this conversation, that some of which Nazir has unpicked about, and what Lucy is talking to as well, is that I sort of feel like I'm looking for something around legitimacy. Is the thing that you say you're experiencing, or the thing that you're feeling or reporting, is it real? I sort of feel like that was my start point for my question. And there's this tension between how bad is it? Is the thing that you've got, the label for it, more or less acceptable socially or in this workplace than this thing over here? But all of those questions seem to be wrong-headed if actually what we're saying is it's impossible to draw lines between one thing and the next. Everybody's situation is different, and the systems that are designed to sort of discern, this word I've been using, between one and the other, are sort of fundamentally inappropriate. I just wonder where we go with that. There's also a sense of some people are allowed to suffer in certain ways and other people aren't. We judge people differently depending on the context and the background. I just sort of feel like there must be a way for us to crack it open that is beyond just everybody needs to be more aware, because none of us can be aware. It's too complicated for us to be aware and really understanding it. Dolly, I can see you nodding. What do you think?
I think I hate to, put this thought into the conversation, but it's even more complicated than what you're saying, because psychiatry itself and the mental health service itself, even if you look at the research, and probably, I don't know if Lucy covers this in her book, but there's a thing called validity and reliability. So, for example, validity is measuring something or a process. It shouldn't, basically, validity means it should measure what it measures. And there are loads of research showing that, for example, I'll talk about my own personal experiences. I have had about 6 or 7 different diagnoses with the same conditions. But I do agree with the speech or voice therapist. I do believe it should start in schools. My partner was an intervention TA, and her job basically was to teach children emotions, because they were feeling all sorts of things, and they couldn't understand what, and just basically teaching children to label their emotions changed a lot. So I think it should be part of the curriculum. Mental health, well, it's a generic term, but teaching children about emotions, teaching children about difficulties they might go through, and techniques to help them, I think would really go far. But also, you know, you have to look at poverty, you have to look at stuff like communication issues, you have to look at stuff like race and class as well. It is just so complicated, and I think if you had a 24-hour discussion, you still wouldn't cover you know, this strange thing called mental health.
Certainly, it's true to say, when we've had thinkers like on this topic before, the sort of remembering to remind ourselves that lots and lots of instances of mental ill health, the mental ill health is a symptom of the house you live in, the job you don't have, the family that you, all of that other stuff, like you say, poverty and so on. That's the point that Luke is making in the chat. I wonder if I might bring in John Randall, who's made a couple of interesting comments. There's one in particular, a question you asked John. I don't know if it was a genuine question or if you have a sense of your answer to it. But you said, are we talking about mental health or emotional health, or are they the same thing? Just tell me what the difference is, if you think there is one, or what were you getting at with that?
Well, I think emotional health can often be included within mental health. And I think for me, they allude to different things. I think mental health is more to do with kind of the mind and our thoughts and those structures, whereas emotional health is more kind of in the gut, and it's the feelings and our emotional health and the things that we feel. So things around you know, sadness and anger aren't necessarily mental health problems, but they will be emotional health problems. Okay, interesting. And so that, I mean, even when you just say that, I've never thought to separate the two, for sure. And then you've just made a point here about learning to cultivate our own will. What are you getting at with that? So, my background, I was trained as a counsellor, right. And so again, that difference between kind of mental health and emotional health. We weren't trained to deal with kind of mental health conditions. It was being trained to deal with emotional health. So, you know, if someone suffered loss or things like that, being able to help with those things. And part of the philosophy that I trained in was that there are two core drivers in us. One is love and one is power. And so the bit around power is your own sense of will. So it could be your goodwill, strong will, things like that. When it goes too far one way, that's when you know, it becomes power over love, and you just have destruction. So being able to function in the world, you know, if we just focused on our well-being and feeling good, then we would just be in a Zen state all the time, and we wouldn't actually be taking action and going into the world and doing things. And so cultivating our will to actually direct our awareness towards the things that we want to achieve and our interactions in life, like that's just as important as building awareness and building a sense of our own emotional health. So when you trained as a counsellor, people have been talking about different talking therapies do different things, and you can't sort of just bucket them. There's pills over here and talking therapies over here, and you just, you know, clearly not. But when you trained as a counsellor, you say we weren't trained specifically to handle mental ill health. If somebody was, you know, really poorly, you'd refer them to somebody different. Also, how does that materialize, that sort of sense of how you know whether you're okay to help somebody on a spectrum of being, you know, just troubled? Yeah, I think different things in terms of like the training. You have to go from the inside out. So we have to have therapy for the 3.5 years that we train. You have to do relational dynamics training where you're in your group and you learn your projections and things like that. So you get to know yourself really well. And so you just sense whether something is within your remit or not. And knowing that it would be dangerous if you try to help someone that you feel you can't help. But certainly like a therapist isn't you can't prescribe pills. You know, that's
Yeah.
GPs and psychiatrists, and so that for me is in another space. But it's knowing that, yeah, you can help someone, knowing whether you've experienced enough or can relate enough to be able to guide them.
Interesting. Thanks ever so much, John. Nice to see you. I'm going to bring in Luke, I think, and maybe Patricia. Luke, you've been very active in the chat, and we're 7 minutes to go. The exam question was, what have we learned? What do you think is new that we can see emerging, or is it just becoming more blurred actually as we understand the complexity of it?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. I've certainly seen, just following the chat and people's discussions here, a few points that have recurred, and we could take that as seeing like, oh, it's treading the same ground again, or you can see it as maybe these recurring points are the ones that are really important and need to be followed up. Patricia, I think John also were talking about the absence of education around mental well-being and mental ill health early years in school. And I think there's probably something to be done there. Yelena was talking about the fact that we've sort of neglected the preventative and holistic side of systems in order to focus on the high risk crisis management side. And given, I think, the sort of resource scarcity that Chris pointed out as well, that makes sense. If you've not got enough trained counselors, therapists, people to look into serious problems that people are going through, you're going to have to prioritize the high risk cases. But we might want to look at that and say, how are we going to deal with the scarcity of trained professionals? And then there's been an undercurrent also, I think, of saying that we've got to look at the fact that mental illness doesn't emerge from nothing. It emerges from a history of your own behavior and the behavior of people around you. And that we might be better served by situating the causes in those things more than in this sort of abstracted idea of becoming unwell. And so even to the point of stress and anxiety, those are abstracts as well. They're abstract nouns, and we might want to think about structures that would help people and teach people to look at the real processes going on in their lives and try to situate the causes there before they turn to the highly sort of commercialized, medicalized version of what's going on for them. But there's a lot more than that besides. Yeah.
Thanks, Luke. I'm going to come back for the last word, perhaps to Lucy, since she's started us off. I'd hoped that over the course of the hour, and I was probably wildly over optimistic, I would get a bit more of a sense of how to orient myself to this sense of rocketing mental ill health, which has been sort of presented both over the long term, which the book helpfully tries to modify that view, but also in the very recent history, when, as you said earlier on, it's a bit too early to say. And given everything that we've understood about the complexity of the conditions, their causes, both genetic, physiological, environmental, all of that stuff, that maybe there's lots and lots of different conditions, or maybe it's just all one and, you know, shades of grey within that. How do you think that collectively, I mean, it's kind of a two-part question. How do you think that sort of collectively as a society we move forward? What's the next thing that we need to do, apart from increase the provision of mental health services tenfold, or whatever the number is, probably a higher number than that? And the second thing is, as a newsroom, if there are questions, journalistic questions that we would want to follow up on, I've made some notes of ones I might think about. What are the sorts of things that you would say we should go and have a sniff around? Is it about looking underneath into the methodology of statistics that are being bandied about by certain types of charities? Is that a place that is helpful for us to go?
To answer your second question first, I think that would be hugely helpful. I wish that in news articles on this topic there was a bit more detail about, you know, when they say 1 in 4 people have mental health problems or something. What do you mean by mental health problems, and how was that measured? Just to let people better understand what that information means. Link to, you know, ONS reports or scientific articles, whatever, you know, provide as much information as possible about where this information is coming from. I think that would be really helpful. And then kind of linking back to your first question, one thing that I think would progress the conversation and that would be good to cover journalistically is more in-depth detail about what these specific disorders really are. You know, not everyone wants to call them disorders or frame them in that way. But for example, if we have a better understanding of what this thing is that we call borderline personality disorder or OCD, or even depression, you know, depression in its full-blown form is awful. It's truly awful, and that is being lost here as we throw that word around. So I think one thing would be really useful is to explain what these conditions are, so that if, you know, if you're at work and someone that you manage says, I have OCD, for example, you know what that means. I think that would be incredibly useful. It would also be clarifying for people who are confused about whether, you know, the extent to which they should be concerned about their own distress.
Thank you very much. It's 29 minutes past 7. I feel like this evening's thinking has been one of those ones which was always going to be too ambitious to try and nail in an hour. We've had some absolutely fascinating contributions, and I want to say a really heartfelt, genuine thanks to all of our invited experts, to Dr. Lucy Foltz, Dolly Sen, Chris Young, and of course to Nazir Asfal, who's a great friend of Tortoise, and we're very grateful to you all for your time. I've made a couple of notes because I like to walk away from the thinking with a bit of a to-do list, or at least something that we can go away and ruminate on. Ben's point that he made earlier about the difference between what the company may present as their mental health awareness credentials and his experience as a person who sort of comes clean, if you like, about his mental health conditions and his experience, I think is really interesting, and something that is part of our responsible business index in terms of walk and talk, but something that we could perhaps drill down a little bit into. I've made a note to look at talking therapies, variation of quality, training, what is available, how well matched are they to people who need them, rather than just we need more, but how well are we matching people to the types of talking therapies that might really benefit of them. And then I will watch back the video of Nazir talking about the criminal justice system, and I think my question was about its efficiency and adequacy at accounting for people's mental health conditions, whether over or under representing them. And it wasn't that his answer was just it's inadequate, but really that it's woefully inadequate, and there is plenty in there journalistically for us to really have a go at and think, how might that be brought to bear, what might be happening? And we will watch with interest, of course, as the government sets to work on its commission. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I really appreciated it. Thank you for coming. I hope you managed to go and have a haircut some point in the coming few days. Do enjoy it. I certainly will be going for one myself. We are back tomorrow at 1 o'clock for our open news meeting. So if you fancy another one, please come back then. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye.